A tense night in downtown Chicago. Red and blue lights flash against the rain-slicked pavement as Officer Brad Connelly steps out of his cruiser. He approaches Maya Thompson's car, his hand resting just a little too comfortably on his holster. His smile is anything but friendly. License and registration. Maya's fingers tighten around the steering wheel. She's been here before. Too many times. But tonight, something in Connelly's eyes tells her this isn't just about intimidation. This is personal. This is a setup. Maya Thompson had spent the evening reviewing legal cases at her office before finally heading home. The city lights blurred past as she drove through the familiar streets of downtown Chicago, the hum of the engine soothing her. But the moment red and blue lights flared in her rearview mirror, her calm shattered. She pulled over, already knowing this wasn't about a broken taillight or a minor traffic violation. As she rolled down the window, Officer Brad Connelly's face appeared, his eyes gleaming with something far more sinister than duty. License and registration. His voice was flat, authoritative. Maya kept her expression neutral as she handed over her documents. "What's the problem, officer?" He studied her for a moment, then scoffed. "This vehicle matches the description of a stolen car. Step out now." Maya let out a slow breath, gripping the wheel tighter. "That's impossible. This is my car registered in my name. You can check the system." Connelly's jaw twitched. He didn't check. Instead, he yanked open the door and grabbed her arm. "I said step out." Maya's pulse pounded. "I know my rights. You have no reason to—" Before she could finish, Connelly wrenched her out, slamming her against the car hood. "Back up now," he muttered into his radio, tightening his grip on her wrist. Maya barely flinched. Instead, she let out a low chuckle, her voice steady despite the pressure against her spine. "You don't know who you're messing with, officer." Connelly smirked. "Yeah, we'll see about that." Instead of taking her to the station, he shoved her into the back of his squad car. But as they drove past the usual police routes, Maya knew this wasn't an arrest. This was something far worse. And yet, when Connelly parked in a dimly lit lot, ready to escalate things, Maya simply smirked. "Your career is already over." Connelly's grip tightened around Maya's arm as he shoved her deeper into the abandoned warehouse, the musty scent of old concrete and rusted metal filling the air. The flickering overhead bulb cast eerie shadows on the walls. He had done this before, intimidated, terrorized, and silenced those who dared to defy him. But tonight, he had no idea that he had made the biggest mistake of his life. As he turned back toward her, gun still holstered but within easy reach, Maya remained calm. Her wrists ached from the tight zip ties, but her expression was unreadable. "You think you're going to walk away from this?" Connelly sneered. "You think someone's coming to save you? Nah, out here no one hears you scream." Maya tilted her head, a small smirk forming on her lips. "That's where you're wrong, officer. They're already listening." For the past 6 months, Maya had been working undercover with a federal task force designed to root out corruption in the police force. She wasn't just a legal consultant. She was a strategist, a silent warrior who fought for those who never got justice. Officer Brad Connelly had been on her radar for years. His record showed a trail of brutality, wrongful arrests, and mysteriously disappeared complaints from victims who were too scared to pursue legal action. Internal affairs had looked the other way, his higher-ups always covering for him. But Maya had seen through the cracks. A pattern had emerged. Every few months, Connelly would target a black driver, claiming the car matched a stolen vehicle report. Some were arrested, some were beaten, and some simply vanished from public records. Maya knew he was part of something bigger, a network of officers working together to cover their tracks, so she had set the perfect trap. Unbeknownst to Connelly, Maya's car was rigged with hidden cameras, capturing everything from the moment he pulled her over. Not just body cam footage, those could be tampered with, but a real-time live feed connected to the task force. And more importantly, she had already triggered an emergency alert on her phone. Every movement, every word, every act of aggression was being recorded and broadcasted to her contacts. Connelly's smirk faltered when she spoke again. This time, her voice laced with quiet confidence. That illegal bust in 18, the missing evidence in 20, you've covered your tracks well, until tonight. His fingers twitched toward his gun. Shut up. Maya chuckled softly, shaking her head. You don't get it, do you? You didn't just pull over any black woman tonight. You pulled over your worst nightmare. Connelly lunged forward, grabbing her phone, his hands fumbling as he tried to unlock it, to erase any trace of evidence. But when the screen lit up, his blood ran cold. His breath hitched. He tried to switch it off, but everything had already been backed up. A sinking realization dawned on him. He had been played. Then in the distance, the sound of approaching sirens. Panic seized his features. He spun toward Maya, his face twisted in rage. You set me up, he growled. Maya simply shrugged. You did that to yourself. The warehouse doors burst open, the beam of flashlights cutting through the darkness. FBI, drop your weapon and put your hands up. Chaos erupted. Connelly didn't hesitate. He shoved Maya aside and bolted for the back exit, adrenaline overriding his panic. He wasn't about to let years of careful cover-ups come crashing down. Not like this. The agents fanned out, some rushing toward Maya, others after Connelly. She gasped, wincing as she sat up, her wrists still aching from the restraints. One of the agents cut her free. Are you hurt? Maya shook her head, her focus entirely on the fleeing officer. He's not going to stop, she murmured, not until he destroys the evidence. The lead agent nodded grimly. Then we make sure he never gets the chance. As the sirens wailed louder and the hunt for Connelly began, Maya knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over yet. Connelly drove like a madman, weaving through the back streets of Chicago, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His hands, still covered in sweat, gripped the steering wheel as his mind raced. His whole career, his whole life was unraveling. He needed help, real help. 15 minutes later, he pulled up to a grand estate on the outskirts of the city. The towering gates creaked open as security waved him in. Inside, a man in a pristine suit waited for him on the steps of the mansion. Deputy Commissioner Alan Reynolds. Reynolds had been his safety net for years, covering up his misconduct, burying evidence, silencing witnesses. If anyone could save him, it was Reynolds. Connelly stormed up the stairs, shoving past security. You need to fix this. Now, he barked, his voice trembling with rage and desperation. Reynolds didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a slow sip of his whiskey, his calculating eyes never leaving Connelly's. Brad, he sighed, setting down his glass. You should have been more careful. Connelly frowned, his stomach tightening. What the hell does that mean? Reynolds leaned forward. It means this is bigger than you now. You got sloppy, and I'm not going down with you. The words hit Connelly like a bullet to the chest. You can't do this, you owe me, he snapped. Reynolds' expression hardened. No, Brad, I owed you. Past tense. Before Connelly could react, Reynolds gave a slight nod to his security team. Escort Officer Connelly off the property. He's no longer welcome here. Two men stepped forward. Connelly stumbled back, shaking his head. No, you can't do this. But they could, and they did. As the gates slammed shut behind him, reality sank in. He was alone, completely alone. Maya stood before the podium at a press conference, cameras flashing in every direction. The entire city was watching. The entire country was watching. She took a deep breath and spoke with unwavering confidence. For years, Corrupt officers like Brad Connelly have terrorized innocent people under the guise of law enforcement. But tonight, justice begins. She gestured toward the screen behind her, where a video began to play. Connelly's own voice, dripping with malice. No one's coming to save you. Out here, no one hears you scream. The room was silent as the damning evidence played, exposing every threat, every fabricated charge, every abuse of power. Within minutes, social media exploded. Justice for Maya began trending worldwide. People flooded the streets, demanding Connelly's arrest, and Connelly, watching from a seedy motel room, realized his nightmare had only just begun. Desperate, cornered, Connelly had only one option left. He grabbed his gun, stole a car, and sped toward his next move. A hostage. At a remote warehouse, Maya's close colleague, Jordan Wells, was preparing evidence when the door burst open. Gunshot. Jordan barely had time to react before Connelly grabbed him, pressing a gun to his temple. "You're coming with me." Maya arrived at the warehouse with a squad of officers, her heart pounding. Through the broken windows, she could see Connelly holding Jordan, his hand twitching on the trigger. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, unarmed. "Brad, it's over," she called out. His eyes were wild, his face gaunt. "You ruined me, Maya," he shouted. "You took everything from me." She didn't flinch. "No, Brad, you did that to yourself." Then she held up her phone and pressed play. It was a new recording, one that had never been heard before. A secret conversation between Connelly and Reynolds, where Connelly admitted to planning evidence, beating suspects, covering up murders. His own words sealed his fate. His grip on Jordan weakened. His entire body trembled. No, this isn't real." Then, in a blind rage, he lunged at Maya. She didn't move, didn't even blink. Because at that very moment, red and blue lights flooded the scene. SWAT officers tackled Connelly to the ground, pinning him as he thrashed. His career, his protection, his power, all gone. And as they dragged him away, Maya exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment finally settling in. Justice had spoken, and it was deafening. The air in the interrogation room was thick with tension. Officer Brad Connelly sat cuffed to the metal table, a smirk lingering on his bruised face despite his battered state. Across from him, Agent Carter of the FBI and Maya Thompson studied him in silence. "You think this is over?" Connelly chuckled, shifting in his seat. "You have no idea how deep this goes." Maya narrowed her eyes. "You have nothing left, Brad. Your career is gone. Your so-called friends abandoned you. The whole world saw what you did." His smirk didn't fade. If anything, it grew. "That's what you think. But there are people in high places who don't want this mess touching them. And trust me, they'll do anything to keep their secrets buried, including getting me out of here." The aftermath of Connelly's arrest sent shockwaves through the police department. Internal affairs scrambled as high-ranking officers, many of whom had protected Connelly, tried to cover their tracks. Records mysteriously disappeared overnight. Witness testimonies were suddenly retracted. Officers who had previously spoken out changed their statements. Someone inside the system was pulling the strings, trying to erase the case before it reached trial. Maya knew Connelly was just the beginning. There were bigger players involved, higher-ranking officers, political figures, and corporate interests who had been shielding corrupt cops for decades, and now they were working overtime to ensure none of it saw the light of day. Maya and the federal task force had been counting on one crucial witness, Sergeant Daniel Brooks, an officer who had once worked alongside Connelly but had since turned against him. Brooks had reached out to the feds a week prior, offering proof of deep-rooted corruption in exchange for protection. But before he could testify, he was found dead. A single gunshot wound, no security footage, no witnesses. The official report ruled it suicide, But Maya knew better. This was a message, a warning to anyone else who dared to speak. The pressure was suffocating. The media was all over the case, but the police department had already begun damage control, feeding the press watered-down reports that downplayed the scale of corruption. Maya knew that if she didn't act fast, everything she had worked for would vanish into bureaucratic nothingness. She needed a new plan, a bold one, a dangerous one. She turned to her team. If they want to erase the truth, then we make sure the whole world sees it first. Maya had one ace left, a full dossier of evidence, audio recordings, video footage, financial transactions linking corrupt officials to cover-ups. Everything. Instead of waiting for the slow, red tape-ridden legal process, she made a radical decision. She leaked everything to the public. She uploaded the entire case file to multiple media outlets, independent journalists, and social media platforms. Within minutes, the internet exploded. News headlines blared, shocking corruption exposed inside Chicago Police Department. Whistleblower leaks, damning evidence against top officers. Brad Connelly's arrest unveils larger conspiracy. Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok flooded with hashtag Justice for Maya, hashtag Expose Corruption, hashtag No More Cover-Ups. The truth was out, and now no one could make it disappear. By nightfall, thousands of people took to the streets. The anger had been simmering for years, and now, with undeniable proof in the public eye, it boiled over. Protesters marched on police headquarters, demanding resignations, arrests, and full-scale reform. The department was in meltdown. Officers loyal to the old system tried to suppress the outrage, but the sheer force of the public's anger was overwhelming. Even the mayor was forced to respond, calling for an emergency inquiry into police corruption. Sitting alone in his cell, Connelly watched the riots unfold on the small TV in the corner. His smirk had long since faded. He had banked on powerful people protecting him, but now they were saving themselves, throwing him under the bus to contain the damage. His leverage gone. And for the first time in his life, Brad Connelly felt something he never had before: fear. As Maya stood on the rooftop of her office, watching the streets filled with protesters demanding justice, she allowed herself a small smile. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was bigger. The movement had begun. The truth had been set free. And no amount of corruption, no amount of backroom deals could ever put it back in the dark. The police department was in free fall. With the protests raging and Maya's evidence flooding every news outlet, the higher-ups knew the walls were closing in. Chief Harold Briggs, the man who had overseen Connelly's unit for years, summoned Maya for a private discussion. She walked into his office, a dimly lit room lined with plaques and photos of him shaking hands with politicians. The old system, the one that had protected men like Connelly, was crumbling. Briggs motioned for her to sit, but she remained standing. "Ms. Thompson," he began, his tone carefully measured, "we both know how this is going to play out. The department needs to move forward, to heal. Public trust is fragile, and the city is already in chaos." Maya crossed her arms. "If you're about to suggest sweeping this under the rug, save your breath." Briggs sighed, rubbing his temples. "I'm offering you a deal. We quietly settle this, let Connelly take the fall, and in return, you back off the larger investigation. We retire a few bad apples, and the public will move on." Maya let out a slow, mirthless chuckle. "So that's it? A few resignations, a press statement, and everything goes back to normal? The same normal that lets officers like Connelly thrive?" Briggs hesitated. "I don't think you understand how dangerous this game is. You push too hard, and you'll make enemies you can't handle." Maya stepped closer, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "I think you don't understand. You're not in control anymore." She turned to leave, throwing one final shot over her shoulder. And I don't make deals with criminals. News cameras flashed as Brad Connelly was led into the courthouse, his orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the crisp uniform he once wore. Inside his holding cell, he paced like a caged animal, muttering to himself. He had lost everything. His friends were gone. His protection had vanished. But he had one last card to play. When his lawyer arrived, Connelly leaned in. "Tell the prosecutor I'm willing to make a deal. Immunity in exchange for names. I'll expose every dirty cop, every politician that's taken bribes, all of it." The lawyer studied him for a long moment. Then slowly he shook his head. "It's too late, Brad." Connelly frowned. "What do you mean, too late?" The lawyer slid a document across the table. A new case file. Connelly's hands trembled as he read the first line. United States versus Brad Connelly. Federal prosecution. The Department of Justice had taken over the case. This wasn't just a local scandal anymore. This was national. His stomach turned as he flipped through the pages. Money laundering, civil rights violations, racketeering. "No," he whispered. His lawyer met his gaze, grim. "Maya Thompson made sure the feds got involved. There's no deal left for you. They don't need your testimony anymore." Connelly slumped back in his chair, his world collapsing in on itself. He had spent his whole life believing he was untouchable, that the system would always protect him. But now, for the first time, he understood what it felt like to be powerless. The courtroom was packed. The air was thick with tension as the judge read the final verdict. For multiple counts of corruption, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations, this court finds the defendant, Brad Connelly, guilty on all charges. Murmurs filled the room. The final nail in the coffin. Connelly sat motionless, his face blank. But Maya, she sat tall, steady, unshaken. As the judge issued a life sentence, Connelly was forced to look her in the eyes. For years, he had wielded fear as his greatest weapon. Now, he saw none in her. Maya leaned in slightly, her voice calm, but filled with an undeniable finality. "You thought you had all the power." She tilted her head, letting the weight of her words sink in. "But you never did." The gavel slammed down, sealing the fate of Brad Connelly and his network of corrupt officials. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the judge read the final convictions, not just for Connelly, but for several high-ranking officers and officials who had protected him for years. The system that had shielded them for so long had finally collapsed under the weight of truth. As Connelly was led away in shackles, his face was pale, his once cocky smirk replaced by hollow silence. But for Maya Thompson, this wasn't just about one man's downfall. It was about the start of something bigger. Outside the courthouse, the world was waiting. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones shoved toward her. "Ms. Thompson, do you believe this will lead to real change? Do you fear retaliation for exposing corruption? What's next for you?" Maya paused on the courthouse steps, looking out at the sea of cameras, the banners held by protesters, the families of victims who had fought for justice for years. She let the questions hang in the air. Then slowly, she smiled. She didn't need to say a word. Justice had spoken, and it was only the beginning. As Maya walked away from the courthouse, her phone vibrated in her pocket. She glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Frowning, she answered. A deep voice on the other end spoke, calm and deliberate. "You did well, Miss Thompson, but you only scratched the surface. There's more, and it goes higher than you think." Maya's breath caught for just a second. Then, click. The line went dead. She looked up, scanning the crowd, but saw nothing unusual. Her victory had come at a cost. And the real fight, it might have just begun.